Hello everyone, Xile here. If you clicked on this video thinking it was Why Trump Won Part 2, I hate to say it, but that is not this video. My editor is locked in my basement. They are not allowed to see the light of day until they finish that video, so it should be coming out in a week or two. But in the meantime, it was recently the three-year anniversary of the Russo-Ukrainian War, and so I thought I'd throw in my 2 cents, give you an idea of what it's like on the ground, and then hopefully sketch out some possible peace deals. Okay, this video will be structured a little differently from my normal videos. No fancy edits, no script even, I'm just kind of riffing it here. I've got these tabs open to act as kind of a general guide, but, you know, it'll be a lot less smooth than my normal affair. Okay. So, broadly speaking here, first I'm going to give you an idea of what the frontline situation is on the ground as of February 25th, 2025. Then we will look at the Trump administration's comments about the war and float maybe what they're looking at in terms of a peace deal. And then at the end I'll give my 2 cents on what I think a ideal peace deal will look like for what that's worth. All right. Also, I'm not going into like why this war started, etc., etc. You know, other people have done a much better job of covering those topics. Okay. So, as far as the frontline situation goes, there are basically 2 fronts that matter. There's Pokrovsk down here in the south, and there is Kursk up here in the north. We'll start with Kursk. So, before I get started, this frontline map should not be taken as gospel. For example, it makes no sense that the Russians would have captured the outskirts of this town, but left their flank completely exposed to Ukrainian counterattack from this village. Yeah, don't. This map is not 100% accurate. Don't think it's, you know, infallible. Okay. So this Kursk offensive, right, the Kursk invasion, was historic for a number of reasons when it occurred back in August 2025. It was the first time Russia proper, has been invaded since World War II. It was also the first time in human history that a nuclear power was invaded by a non-nuclear power, and it basically demonstrated to the West that all of Putin's talk about red line this, red lines that was just a bunch of hot air, right? And that's also why immediately after this Kursk invasion, basically the Biden administration and the UK gave the green light for for Ukraine to use HIMARS and other missile systems to target deep into Russia without expecting retaliation. Yeah. So, at its largest territorial extent, the Ukrainians managed to capture everything from Koryevo here to the north to something over here in the south. They managed to cross this reservoir and capture some land up here. And they also had advanced farther out in this southeastern direction here. So the Russians have managed to recoup about 50% of the territory gained in 6 months. But they have not got all of it. And this is a continual source of embarrassment for Putin. Because when this invasion initially happened, hundreds of thousands of people had to evacuate, right? Because they weren't really sure, how far the Ukrainians would get. So they evacuated hundreds of thousands of people, and most of those people have not been able to return to their homes because the Ukrainians still hold all of this territory. And, when the invasion first happened, Putin claimed that he would have the whole province liberated within 2 weeks. It's 6 months later, and it still has not been liberated. So this is a real thorn in the Kremlin's side. Additionally, Ukraine still holds the major town of Sudza. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Which they are using as a supply hub and shelter from Russian airstrikes and missiles and drones. Okay. So why is the Kursk offensive important? Basically, the thinking with the Kursk offensive, according to most analysts, is that this was designed to be used as a bargaining chip, essentially in the case of a peace deal, it could be traded for some other Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine. It was also used to divert resources and manpower away from the Pokrovsk front, which is what we'll touch on now. Okay, here's the city of Pokrovsk. I think it's got like 150,000 people. Okay, so fairly moderately sized city. Now, a year ago in February, the Russians successfully captured this town here at Avdiivka. And since then, everybody's known that Pokrovsk is their next target. They've been swinging out along this kind of general arc up towards Pokrovsk. Why Pokrovsk? If you look on this map here, you can see this highway H32 runs to the east of Pokrovsk and services much of this front line in this general direction. So the thinking is, if the Russians can capture Pokrovsk, they can cut this supply line here, and they can essentially cause this entire section of the front line here to collapse, which would allow them to gain a significant amount of territory. Of course, that's assuming that they can take the city. Now, the Russians have been attempting to flank Pokrovsk from the west over here. But Ukraine, according to reports that I've seen, have been able to launch several successful counterattacks in this village here and in this village here, significantly delaying the Russian response and the Russian ability to continue their offensive. Additionally, this river here doesn't have any bridges left standing, so the Russians are unable to get armor into these villages here to support their offensives, so all of their offensives are infantry based, and we'll talk about why that's a problem in a second. Okay, so those are the two major front lines. Now, is Russia still gaining territory? Yes they are. But there are several problems with the Russian war effort. Okay, let's go to this map here. All right, this is Google Earth. Where is Avdiivka? Okay, there's New York. Avdiivka. Okay, here we go. Here's Avdiivka. So let's do some quick math, all right? From Avdiivka to Pokrovsk is about 50 kilometers. If you Americans watching want to convert that into cheeseburgers per bald eagle, do it on your own time. Okay, so in 1 year they've advanced about 50 kilometers. From Pokrovsk to Kiev, which is the capital, which in order to get Ukraine to actually surrender, the Russians will probably need to take, is another 600 kilometers. Okay, so 50 kilometers in a year, 600 kilometers if we do some quick math, that will be another 12 years. Already you can see the problem. There's no way that the Russians can continue fighting for 12 more years. Now, what's the problem? Why can't they keep fighting for another 12 years? Well, there's multiple dimensions to this, but the first we'll talk about is armor. So, at the beginning of the war, right, famously, Russia sent these giant, armored columns just straight down the roads, headed straight towards Kiev. And then they ran out of fuel and were bombed to smithereens, and all their soldiers had to retreat back to Russia on foot. Before the war started, it was reported that Russia had about 4,000 tanks. Okay, 4,000 tanks or more. Okay? But what you have to understand, and what most analysts got wrong before the war actually kicked off, is, okay, the word corruption is getting thrown around a lot now, right? It's a very, very hot topic. When we say that the U.S. military is corrupt, we just mean that we overpay for Javelin missiles to the military-industrial complex. But the key is that those missiles still get delivered, right? We're not paying for nothing. We're just overpaying sometimes. In Russia, this is not the case. So most people, right, that join up in the armed forces in America do it out of some vague sense of nationalism / patriotic duty. This is almost non-existent in Russia. People join the army in Russia to make money, full stop. That's why some of their most effective units at the beginning of the war were mercenaries, because mercenaries get paid very, very well and are thus, more motivated to fight. So what this means is that in all of these weapons storage sites, right? So here's a nice photo of one in, Burat. I can't pronounce that. It's by China. It's by China. Okay. The commanders of these deposits regularly will essentially sell off their own stockpiles for scrap metal and pocket the difference, right? So on paper, before the war started, it might have said that Russia had 4,000 tanks stored at this one site, a couple thousand here, a couple thousand there, whatever. About a third of those tanks simply no longer existed, right? They were written down on a sheet of paper that said that they existed, but they had been sold for parts potentially 4 decades ago, right? And definitely no longer exist. Another third, and I'm ballparking these numbers here, another third of those tanks, leaving your tanks in the middle of a field is not a good idea, especially in Russia where the winters are very, very harsh, right? So a lot of these tanks over the decades have started to break down. So there's about another third of these tanks that could still be used as functional fighting vehicles, but need extensive repairs to do so. And these parts have to be cannibalized, essentially, from other tanks. So what this means is, at the beginning of the war, you saw armored assaults with, say, 2 to 3 tanks and, 5 to 6 infantry fighting vehicles. Okay? Then, about 6 months later, it was, okay, maybe you get 1 tank and maybe 5 infantry fighting vehicles. Then it was, okay, maybe you get 2 infantry fighting vehicles and the rest are just regular trucks. Then you get to today where you get 1 or 2 trucks and the rest of the troops are on motorcycles, or you get no trucks, no infantry fighting vehicles, no tanks, just purely infantry assaults. Simply put, the Russians are running out of everything. Okay, especially tanks, especially infantry fighting vehicles. Now, can't they just make more? Well, the answer is yes and no. So first let's look at the losses, right? So Russia has lost about 2,500 tanks in the course of this war. Just tanks. Okay? So if they weren't able to replace their losses, that would mean they have 368 tanks left. Recently, Russia has completely switched tactics. Instead of having mixed infantry and armor assaults, they are concentrating all of their armor for specific armor assaults, right? So they're not doing mixed assaults anymore. They're either doing full infantry or full armor. But of course, the full armor assaults are extremely rare now because they're out of tanks. So again, can they make more tanks? The answer is yes. There's a factory here in in southern Russia, which manufactures T-90s And they also have 4 other factories which take their older Soviet-era tank models like the T-72 and the T-80 and sort of modernize them for modern warfare. Hilariously, the main Soviet tank production facility was here in Kharkiv, which is part of Ukraine. So a lot of these older tank models, they cannot build anymore. Additionally, the Kremlin claims that it builds 1,500 brand new tanks from this factory that I mentioned earlier. I call bullshit. There is simply no way they are receiving 500 new tanks per year because of Western sanctions, right? So Western sanctions have been piling on since the war started. A lot of the technology, a lot of the equipment needed to make these modern tanks simply no longer exists. Now, China has been able to provide some of the gap, but recently China has been much more careful about the sanctions, and before they were only exporting so-called dual-use materials. That's things like machine tools that could be used to build tanks, but could also be used to build tractors, right? Think of it that way. And recently they've really started being extra careful not to cross the sanctions and risk retaliation from the West, okay? In fact, the situation is so bad that countries such as Myanmar and India, which had previously bought Russian tanks, are now reselling those tanks back to Russia because the Russians need them. And India, I know, is looking elsewhere now for its modern series of tanks, and I think they're actually reviving their own homegrown tank program because of this chaos. So, why is the Russian army losing so many tanks? The short answer is drones. All right, let's talk about the drones. So, just like the Civil War was defined by the Mediball, and just like the Vietnam War was defined by the helicopter, it is my belief that the Ukraine War will be defined by the drone. It's the hot new technology. So, you know, this war, a lot of people have pointed this out, not just me. This war resembles World War I in a lot of ways, right? We're seemingly back to the area of artillery duels and trench warfare. How the heck did that happen? World War I was 100 years ago. Well, if we think of World War I as kind of the baseline for what a modern war looks like, what caused that to change? What shattered that preconception, that old modality of fighting? The answer was the tank, right? The tank made it to where you could blitz past fortifications, surround people. It introduced an element of mobility to warfare that didn't exist previously. But now we have lots of counters to the tank, one of which is mines. Mines have been very important in this war. But another one is the drone. Now, the main advantage to a drone as opposed to a guided missile is that a guided missile is always going to be more powerful, right? Nobody has developed a drone that is more powerful than a missile, right? But drones are much cheaper and much easier to manufacture, which means Ukraine can pump out, hundreds or thousands of them a year, no sweat. And if it costs, let's say it costs $1,200 to manufacture a drone, and you use that to blow up a tank that costs $10 million to build, obviously the cost to damage ratio there is enormous and highly beneficial to the drone user. Now, of course, there are ways to counter drones. You'll see Russian tanks with these ridiculous-looking cages around them. The idea is if you can get the drone to blow up on the cage, it won't be able to impact the tank itself. There's also been an introduction of electronic warfare systems, basically jammers. Drones require electromagnetic waves to communicate with their operators, and if you can flood the area around your tank with essentially noise, the signal from the drone operator to the drone can't get through. But there's a counter to that, which is you hardwire the drone and the operator together using fiber optic cables, and on the cycle of technology and countermeasure repeats. But the headline here is that drones have been a very effective weapon against Russian armor in general. Okay? The other big issue with the Russian war effort, and to be fair, they have improved on this significantly. It is logistics, right? So in the beginning of the war, I mentioned, right, they had those giant armed columns rolling through towards Kiev, but they just straight up ran out of fuel. The Russian logistical planning is terrible. And this is mostly due to the corruption that I mentioned before, right? Why would you keep 100 gallons of oil if you could sell 50 of those gallons, because the odds that you're actually going to need all that fuel are very, very slim, until of course you actually do need all that fuel. So they've improved on this pretty significantly in recent times. We're no longer in the situation. If you remember the Wagner Rebellion, and I believe that was 2023, this was why that happened. The Russian logistics simply couldn't keep Wagner supplied, and it was costing them lives, right? And so that's what caused Prigozhin to get pissed off, and that's what caused him to rebel. So recognizing this, they have improved, but Russian logistics are still very vulnerable to Ukrainian drone and missile strikes, and there have been numerous cases within the past couple months of strikes on Russian supply depots and stuff like that. I've heard reports that Russians are resorting to using mules to transport ammunition and food to the front line. That's how desperate things have gotten. Okay. So, with all that being said, the Russian ability to prosecute this war is rapidly becoming non-existent, basically. They've lost about 1 million soldiers. 1 million. Like, think about that. That's more than the U.S. lost in every war combined in its history except for the Civil War. Okay? Like, that is a astronomical number. They've lost about 1 in 50 of their male population, which is terrible. And Russia double can't afford this because most of the men that have been dying are young men, and Russia has been facing a terrible demographic collapse, and so the more young men that die, the worse that collapse will become, the less children there will be in the next generation, which will only hasten the essentially death of the entire Russian ethnicity. Okay. What this means is that, in my opinion, Ukraine is basically winning. So even though, according to this map, they're losing ground inch by inch, they're still making successful counterattacks pretty frequently, and the Russian ability to prosecute this war has been greatly diminished. That's why they've been, importing troops and ammo from North Korea. I mean, if you have to import like ammunition from most impoverished country in Asia, North Korea, you're pretty freaking desperate, right? And by the way, all of those North Korean soldiers were deployed to Kursk, but they've all been taken off the front line because over half of them died, and the remaining, 4,000 or so had begun to shoot at Russian contingents out of anger. So they're essentially mutinies in the north. I've seen numerous reports of mutinies in the south. Russian morale has basically collapsed. Every assault now is either a huge armor assault that gets wiped out by minefields and FPV drones in a matter of minutes, or an infantry assault that is mowed down by artillery and Ukrainian machine guns. So progress has basically stalled, is what I'm saying. you know, the amount of square kilometers Russia captures per day is under 1, and the number of casualties that Russia has been sustaining is at a high point. I think the high point was actually in November, December, and it's come down a little bit since then. But at one point, Russia was losing something like 14 to 1,600 people per day, 100 soldiers per day. That is absolutely unsustainable. Okay, with all that being said, now that we have a good picture of where things stand, let's go into the American response. Actually, I'm lying. There's one other thing I have to tackle before we get there, and that is the monetary contribution to Ukraine from both Europe and the United States. So, by the way, all these charts are in euros. Okay. So, the United States has given 114 billion euros worth of military aid. To put that into perspective, that is about 1/8 of the yearly budget of the Pentagon, right? So we're spending 1/8 of 1 year of our total military budget. Put another way, that is 1/4 the net worth of Elon Musk. Europe, on the other hand, has spent a total 132 billion euros, which, if you know basic math, is more than the United States, despite what some have been claiming. And if we go down here, a lot of this aid has been financial in the form of loans, a little bit has been humanitarian, and 64 billion euros worth has been straight military. Now, another thing you have to understand about this military aid, we're not giving them F-35s. We're not giving them the latest and greatest of the U.S. war machine. We're giving them Abrams and Bradleys and F-16s. Basically, we're giving them last-gen tech. Now, this makes sense because we don't want our fancy new toys to potentially be shot down and, analyzed by the Russians and have all their weak points exposed, etc. But what you got to understand is that a lot of this material was just sitting in storage in the United States. We have to pay for that storage. So by giving them these weapons, we're actually saving a significant amount of money by doing this. Okay? Another thing, a lot of this financial aid is in the form of loans. Theoretically, Ukraine is going to pay us back at some point, although, who knows if that's actually going to happen. Yeah. Excuse me, I need another drink. So, it has been a popular narrative to, disparage the Ukrainian war effort because something, the American taxpayer doesn't want to pay for a war in, Europe, why are we doing this, etc., etc. Okay, two things on that. First of all, we're spending, again, 1/8 of the Pentagon budget to essentially checkmate our our second greatest geopolitical rival. China is our greatest, without a single American dying. That is a great deal. Okay, we're not going to get a better deal than that. That is a fantastic deal from every angle, right? The Russia has been basically brought to its knees just by us spending this comparatively small amount of money. The other point here is that, shoot. Yes, okay. The other point here is what is known as, I was going to go over this in one of my, Why Trump Won videos, but I guess I'll address it here now. There is this concept called imperial core privilege, okay? So since the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States has been, geopolitically at least, the center of the world, right? We live in a monopole world, or we lived, I should say. It's not that way today. We lived in a monopole world where the United States was the top dog, and there are certain benefits that come with that. Okay, certain invisible benefits. For example, if you look at the inflation under the Biden administration, it was bad, but if you compare it to, say, the UK or Germany or Australia or Japan or China or Russia or Turkey or Israel or India or any other countries, it was actually much better. Why? Because the United States dollar is the global reserve currency. That means more people hold the United States dollar than any other currency. So, essentially, any amount of money that is printed by the United States government is distributed over a wider pool of total money. If you think about inflation as a percent change, as a fraction, where the numerator is the amount of money we just printed, and the denominator is the total amount of money that exists in that particular currency, the denominator of that fraction, the total amount of US currency, is bigger than any other currency, at least in terms of raw value. And this means that inflation affects us less than it does pretty much any other country on Earth. And this is just one of the examples of imperial core privilege. There's also trade deals and soft power things in terms of, our cultural reach, the fact that theaters all over the world show American movies, etc., etc. Now, you can lose your imperial core privilege. You can essentially, like Atlas, you can put the weight of the world on somebody else's shoulders, and that's fine. But what most people don't seem to understand is that there's very real costs associated with that. And if we in the United States essentially say that, we're going to not involve ourselves in Ukraine, and we're going to take a step back from Europe, and we're going to distance ourselves from NATO, there are very real economic, political, and cultural consequences to that I very rarely see considered. Okay? So, with all that out of the way, yeah, let's move into the Trump comments now. All right, here we go. Oh God. Okay, we'll start with freaking Pete Hegseth. So Pete Hegseth, I think it was about a week ago, went on and gave a speech, and I'll just read through part of that. Okay. So, we want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine, but we must start by recognizing that the return to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders, which means Crimea plus Donetsk and Luhansk, is a unrealistic objective. Okay. So here's the deal. This is a true statement, right? It is unrealistic that Ukraine magically somehow will just gain back all, like Russia will just let them take all that territory back. It's not going to happen. The problem is, why the hell would you say this? You're essentially, you're essentially like imagine you're playing Go Fish with someone, and before the game has even started, you just drew all your cards. You just announce what all of your cards are to your opponent. That would be a terrible idea, and that is essentially what he's doing here. So yes, everybody knows that this is if Ukraine were to demand a return to its pre-2014 borders, that would be a ridiculous demand. The US knows it, Ukraine knows it, Putin knows it. But to admit so publicly has already shifted the framing or the window of possible negotiations in a way that negatively impacts Ukraine. Does that make sense? And we'll see this as a running theme in this Hegseth speech. Okay, chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering, blah, blah, blah. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. I agree, although what I consider to be a robust security guarantee appears to be different than Pete Hegseth's definition. This must not be Minsk 3.0, which is an hilarious statement. He says this must not be Minsk 3.0 while doing everything in his power to ensure that this is Minsk 3.0. Awesome. For those of you who don't know, Minsk 1.0 and 2.0 occurred back in 2014 when Russia invaded Donetsk and Luhansk, and they were negotiated, and then Russia broke the ceasefire, and then it was negotiated again, and then Russia broke the ceasefire again. Awesome, yeah. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Okay, again, this is... So, Russia, ostensibly, one of the reasons why this war started was to prevent NATO membership for Ukraine, ostensibly. There were a bunch of different reasons, but that's one of the big ones, right? So, you know, saying this is not necessarily wrong, right? It's not necessarily factually incorrect. But again, why would you say this? Why would you say this before negotiations have even started? You're already moving the goalposts like so far away beyond Ukraine's reach. And Ukraine, believe me, definitely wants to be in NATO. Okay, they 10,000% want to be in NATO. So by already denying this to them before negotiations have even started, why the hell would you do that? Okay. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops, whatever that means. Essentially, oh, here we go. If these troops are deployed as peacekeepers to Ukraine, at any point they should be deployed as part of a non-NATO mission, and they should not be covered under Article 5. Oh my god, why? Okay, so essentially what he's saying here is he wants the UN. He wants UN troops. Now, you know, I mentioned in my first Why Trump Won video about the death of liberalism and the liberal world order. One of the consequences of this decline of the liberal world order that I did not have time to mention was the decline in the relevance of the UN. So, you know, back in the 90s, Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo had a little tiff called the Second Congo War, which was the deadliest conflict since the Second World War. Most of you have probably never heard of it because most people don't give a shit about Africa, unfortunately. But yeah, it was very real and it happened, and the United Nations tried to maintain the peace. They sent a bunch of peacekeepers in, but they ultimately failed to prevent the outbreak of war. In modern times, tensions between the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Rwanda, and Burundi are increasing rapidly, and now the UN's not even trying to intervene. They're basically washing their hands of the whole thing. The point is, the UN's useless, and it has been useless for some time, but it is completely useless now, especially in its role as peacekeepers. I mean, just look at what happened in Gaza and Lebanon recently, right? So, by saying that, you know, they won't be part of NATO, and they won't be covered under Article 5. Oh, by the way, for those of you who don't know, Article 5 is the article in the NATO Charter that says an attack on one NATO country is an attack on all NATO countries. So, for example, if Russia were to bomb Poland, that would drag in every single country in NATO would automatically act like it had been the one that had just been bombed and declare war on Russia. Okay, that's what Article 5 means. So, like, why the hell would you say this? It's just a completely... It basically guarantees... So Russia, right? I mentioned before that their war machine is in decline, and that is very, very much true. But if, you know, a peace negotiation were negotiated within the next couple months, that would give them time to rearm, lick their wounds, modernize their military, you know, get their troops some actual training, reorganize their mercenary corps, etc., etc., etc. And then, you know, in 3 years' time, they would be in a much better position and could just straight up reinvade Ukraine. And that's the biggest fear. That is the outcome that Ukraine is doing will do everything in its power in these upcoming negotiations to avoid. That is the scenario that Ukraine does not want to happen. Okay, but by saying that these troops won't be part of NATO and they won't be covered under Article 5, you're basically guaranteeing that this will happen, right? Because what is stopping Russia from just, reinvading Ukraine? It reminds me of the, appeasement situation in 1938, right? Chamberlain negotiated with Hitler and said, yeah, sure, you can have the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. They gave it up without a fight, even though it was very well fortified and the Czechs could theoretically have fought tooth and nail for it, but they never got the chance because Britain and France sold them out. It reminds me of the same thing. Like, why would you appease a dictator, Putin, and then assume that he would stick to his word and that this would not become Minsk 3.0? Why would he do that? What's stopping him from just reinvading Ukraine? And I guess the next line of logic would be, well, we don't care if he reinvades Ukraine as long as the U.S. isn't part of it. Okay, well then why the hell are we negotiating on behalf of Ukraine if that's the case? We should just let them do their thing and, sit back. It's baffling. Okay. To be clear, as part of any security guarantee, there will not be U.S. troops deployed to Ukraine. Okay, this I do agree with. If the U.S. were to deploy troops on the border with Russia, it would be seen as a huge provocation. We definitely cannot do that. But again, there's a big difference between U.S. troops and NATO troops. Okay, and then he talks about energy prices and a bunch of other... Oh, here's another big one. So, famously in his first term, Trump continually harped on and on about, NATO member countries not paying their fair share, essentially. According to the NATO Charter, each country needs to pay 2% of their GDP towards military, and the number of countries that were actually doing that were like Poland and like Luxembourg or something, and that was it. Which is fair. That was a fair call out, I guess. But now, of course, we're moving the goalposts again. 2% is not enough. Now we need 5%. Or hell, why not 10% or 15%? Or just bankrupt yourselves until you're no longer able to fight at all, and Russia can just steamroll all of you. 5% for like Poland, for Finland, maybe Sweden, for the Baltics. Okay, that makes sense. But I don't see a world where France and Germany need to dedicate 5% of their GDP towards defense in order to be guaranteed safe from Russia. And the U.S. demanding this is, quite frankly, ridiculous. Okay? Now, maybe this is a negotiating position. Maybe they'll negotiate it back down. Who knows? But on the face of it, this is an absurd request. Okay. All right. I think that's all I wanted to cover. Yeah, Poland's already spending 5%. Why is Poland spending that 5%, though? Is it because Trump told them to? No, it's because of Russia invaded Ukraine. If you look at the graph of Poland military spending, it's very clear that it spiked up starting in 2022. So basically, none of the Europeans cared what Trump said. It was only the very real threat of Russia that forced them to spend more money. So maybe a bunch of them will spend this 5% or at least close to it. But threatening to withdraw from NATO over this issue is a huge mistake. Okay, so after Hegseth gave all of these remarks, we'll call them, Trump was not happy with him. Now, Pete Hegseth has never negotiated anything in his life. He was a Fox News contributor before this. He served in the Army for like a year in like the logistics department or something, which is important. I harped on and on about the importance of logistics, not knocking it. But to act like, my guess is that he was upset that he wasn't invited to the table. So he thought that he would get his opinions and stuff out there. And instead he got clowned on by basically everybody. According to one of my inside sources, yes, I have real inside sources that are at least adjacent to the Trump administration, Trump was pissed off at him for this. He was angry, and Hegseth had to walk back a lot of this stuff that he said. So this was the first round of kind of the Trump administration taking a stab at what a potential Ukrainian peace deal could look like. Let's go to the second example now. So here is pictured, Vice President J.D. Vance. These pictures get increasingly ridiculous as I'll move through them because he is a ridiculous person, and the speech he gave at the Munich Security Conference was so ridiculous, I'm not even going to bother to read it. Basically, what this man said was the greatest threat to Europe is not Russia, but is their lack of freedom of speech. Yes. Imagine you went back in time to Abraham Lincoln, and you said, Abraham Lincoln, the greatest threat to the Union is not the Confederacy. It's not Robert E. Lee. It's actually the fact that you suspended the right of habeas corpus. What? What are you talking about, dude? Much has been made about Zelensky not stepping down or not holding elections, even though in times of war, elections are not supposed to be held according to the Ukrainian constitution, which I'm sure some of the people watching this didn't know. Winston Churchill did the same thing in World War II. So, while we can sit here and say, it's not a good thing that elections weren't held. I love this one. This one's amazing. Well, it's not a good thing that these elections weren't held. To call Zelensky a dictator because of it is just ridiculous. We'll get to that in a second here. Of course, most of the examples that Mr. Vance here cited of so-called violations of free speech were absolute nonsense. I'm not going to debunk them here. Other people have done that. You can go and look at some of those for yourself. But this whole thing was basically just a culture war virtue signal, signaling to all of his compatriots in America that he's fighting the woke European bureaucracy, whatever. And he said this speech to a room full of generals, and the generals were just absolutely confused, completely baffled. He was supposed to talk about security, and he just ranted about free speech and a couple choice European laws for like 30 minutes. The whole thing was nonsense, basically. Okay, I lied. This one is my favorite. Look at that little guy. Look at that little guy. Now, yeah. So his comments basically shouldn't be taken seriously, is my point. All right. Now let's get to the big dog himself, Donald Trump. All right. Oh, God. Okay, so he made this Truth Social post. When was this? 6 days ago at the time of recording this. And I'm just going to read this thing and go through it point by point. So, joy. Think of it. A modestly successful comedian, Volodymyr Zelensky, talked the United States of America into spending $350 billion to go into a war that couldn't be won, that never had to start, but a war that he, without the U.S. and Trump, will never be able to settle. Okay, right off the bat here, $350 billion. I already showed you the real numbers. It's not even close to that. Okay, second thing, a war that never had to start. I've seen Trump recently claim that Zelensky is responsible for the war in Ukraine starting, which is completely out of the realm of reality, right? I mean, it's honestly baffling. I'm honestly at a loss for words. I can't even debunk such a claim because it's so ridiculous. It has been popular among certain circles, mostly right ones, but I've seen a couple lefties jump on this narrative too, that Ukraine and the U.S. are responsible for the war starting because of the expansion of NATO, basically the great NATO sob story as it's known. I do not have time to debunk that whole narrative in this video. I will leave a link in the description, though, to a video by a channel called Sarcasmatron, which he's amazing, by the way, and is honestly one of the main inspirations for this channel. Love him, love his work. If you're curious about the origins of the Russo-Ukraine war, why it started, he also has a series on that, and the video about NATO is part of it. I'll leave a link to that NATO video down in the description below. But anyway, yeah, it's ridiculous that he claimed this. Oh, and also he says this like every interview where he does the routine of,
if I was president, this war would have started. It's all Joe Biden's fault. It never would have happened. Israel never would have been invaded if only I was president. And I was president. I won the 2020 election,
etc., etc. You know, show me the time machine. Show me the time machine that takes you to the alternate reality where Trump did win and the Russia-Ukraine war didn't start. Oh, what's that? You can't do that? Okay, great. Then shut the hell up. All right, moving on. The United States has spent $200 billion more than Europe. Again, this is not true. We already went over this. And Europe's money is guaranteed while the United States will get nothing back. I'm pretty sure this is a lie, although I haven't actually debunked this one. Why didn't Sleepy Joe demand equalization in that this war is far more important to Europe than it is us? Okay, I mean, that's true. It is more important to Europe than it is us. That is true. We have a big, beautiful ocean as separation. Yes, that is how oceans work. On top of this, Zelensky admits that half the money we send him is missing. I've seen this peddled a lot recently. As far as I can tell, he never said this. And it seems that all of the cases of, you know, Western aid supposedly missing, air quotes there, is because we did not, like, somebody got an email that said, hey, we sent this amount of money or this amount of bullets or whatever to Ukraine. Please log it in this data table, and somebody somewhere just hasn't checked their email and punched in the numbers. Okay, so there's actually not that much that is missing, and the stuff that is missing is mostly our fault. You know, the tales of Ukraine selling freaking rocket launchers to Mexican drug cartels is completely absurd. Why the hell would Mexico need to buy arms from Ukraine when the United States is right there and has incredibly loose gun laws, and they can just go into the U.S. and buy a bunch of guns and come back? Like, that happens all the time. Yeah. Insane. Anyway, he refused to have elections. Yeah, we already talked about that. Is very low in the Ukrainian polls. This is just a straight up lie. Like, you know, he said that he has 4% approval rating. No, that's not true. And the only thing that he was good at was playing Biden like a fiddle. I mean, you know, he did know how to play Biden. I'll give him that. A dictator without elections. Ugh, come on, man. Zelensky. Oh yeah, and it also came out today that, you know, Donald Trump was directly asked to call Putin a dictator, which he refused to do. Putin is so obviously much more of a dictator than Zelensky. Like, come on. Zelensky better move faster. He will not have a country left. In the meantime, we are successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia, something I'll admit only Trump and the Trump administration can do. I mean, you're admitting that, and the people that like you are admitting that. I don't know if everyone is admitting that. Biden never tried. Is that true? That might be true. Europe has failed to bring peace, and Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going. This is disgusting. This is disgusting. The implication that Zelensky wants to keep this war going, that he wants to have his own people continue to be bombed and killed just so that he can collect more money from the United States, disgusting to even imply that. And he's not implying it. He's directly saying it. Wow. I love Ukraine, but Zelensky has done a terrible job. His country is shattered and millions have unnecessarily died. Well, that is true. Millions have unnecessarily died, but you can't pin that on Zelensky. And so it continues. Okay. Wow. Oh, God. You know, what's funny is that his line here about Zelensky doing a terrible job before this war started, you know, Zelensky's approval rating, I think, was hovering at about high 30%. So he wasn't super unpopular, but he wasn't exactly beloved. And a lot of his reforms, people thought, you know, didn't go far enough and didn't go fast enough until the war started. And I swear, because of this war and the leadership that he's shown, he will be regarded as one of the great leaders of the 21st century. And I do mean that. You know, the fact that he visits the front lines to inspire his troops and, you know, meets with other leaders and wears a military uniform but doesn't stud himself in a bunch of medals like a freaking North Korean. Yeah, he's just the textbook definition of a leader in hard times. Props to him. All right. Where does that leave us? So why... I've seen this question asked a lot. Why is Trump and his administration so pro-Russia? There's been a lot said on this topic. Some people are saying he's a KGB agent. Some people are saying they have dirt on him. Russia has dirt, financial or otherwise, on him. I don't buy that, simply because if the Russian government released a video released a video of him and Jeffrey Epstein doing the dirty dangle, I seriously don't think it would matter. I think his supporters would just say it was AI generated, it's fake news, yada yada. I doubt his approval rating would even take a hit. So I personally, I don't buy that. Some people have said it's because Putin is fascist, Donald Trump is aligning himself ideologically with fascists. Fascist governments tend to like each other. Okay, maybe. Or if you don't want to say fascist, you can say authoritarian in general. Yeah. I don't know the reason, to be honest. I don't know the exact reason that all this is happening, but it is happening. It is very clear that he is, negotiating directly with Putin, not even inviting Ukraine to those negotiations. How insulting. That is such a huge insult to the Ukrainian people and their resolve, to not even bother inviting them to the negotiations of the war that they're fighting, that we're not fighting. We're not fighting that war. We've given them some money. That's it. We're not fighting that freaking war. And yet we're not inviting them to the peace talks. It's insane. But maybe some good will come out of this, because I have seen the Europeans come together like I've never seen them before, and unconditionally and full-heartedly back Ukraine, which is very good. I'm happy to see that. I doubt that was what Trump was going for, but it has definitely been a consequence of his actions that is positive. Okay, I will say that. One last thing, can we stop with the whole, Trump is a master negotiator bit? It's just not true. I mean, seriously, think about a single deal that he has negotiated. The past trade deal he made with Canada and Mexico, name me 5 points that were an improvement upon NAFTA. Functionally, they were pretty much identical. And then, of course, now he's threatening tariffs on them and tearing up the great and perfect deal that he himself negotiated. You repeat a lie enough times, it becomes a truth, and this is definitely a case of that. He's just repeated this so many times that people just assume it's true. I haven't seen any evidence of this. In fact, I believe that he is a terrible negotiator, and Putin is the one playing him like a fiddle. I think Putin understands Trump on a psychological level very well, and knows that if he sucks up to him and boosts his ego and stuff, that Trump will bend over backwards to appease him. And that is basically what we are seeing play out in real time. Okay, I've talked disparagingly about the Trump administration enough. Let's say what I would want. In a perfect universe, if I was in charge of the entire peace negotiations, God forbid, what would I want? Okay. So first, let's talk territory. I mentioned earlier about Kursk. I would exchange this Kursk territory for some of this territory up here. Maybe clean up the front line here around Pokrovsk a little bit. Maybe get some of this territory across this river. I don't know which river this is, but get some of this territory across this river back to Ukraine. Yeah. Also, set up a DMZ, which is ideally taken out of the Russian chunk of the territory. And now we get to the question, who's going to guard the DMZ? So I mentioned earlier that Hegseth said that he didn't want NATO troops to guard this DMZ. So the issue here, and the reason also that peace negotiations haven't occurred beforehand, is because Russia cannot allow a situation in which another NATO country is on its border, right? Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and now Finland have already joined NATO. Norway was already in NATO too, I believe. Yes. And then Poland also borders Kaliningrad here, which, yes, is part of Russia. So Russia cannot allow another NATO member on its borders. That is simply, from a security standpoint, that is absolutely unacceptable to them. But Ukraine cannot allow a peace treaty that results in them having no security guarantees, because then Russia would just, again, wait 3 years and invade them again. Now, it sounds like there is no middle ground here, right? Either Ukraine is in NATO or it's not in NATO. How can it be both? Well, the solution to this conundrum, I believe, is to revive the Intermarium. Okay, this was a proposal during the interwar period. Intermarium, right, means between the seas. So this was a proposal in the interwar period between World War I and World War II of essentially an alliance that encompassed all of these countries. And if we were to recreate something like this, it would involve, let's say, Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic nations, Finland, throw in Romania, throw in maybe Sweden, maybe Turkey if they want to play, and then, backed by one of the major EU countries like Germany or France. Such an alliance network would not be part of NATO. It would not be counted under the umbrella of NATO, or at least Ukraine wouldn't be counted under the umbrella of NATO, but would be strong enough to deter Russian aggression and would hopefully appease Putin enough to where he, would accept such a deal. Okay, so that's my idea, that's my theory of kind of how you get around that extremely sticky situation. Okay? Lastly, prisoner exchange, standard stuff. As far as like the oil pipelines go, the infrastructure for accepting liquefied natural gas and other alternative forms of energy is already in place in Europe. I see no reason to, as Trump is apparently wanting to do, lift the sanctions on Russia and start the oil flowing again. There's just no point. I don't know why. I don't know even if, Germany would be willing to accept Russian oil again. Also, I'm pretty sure somebody blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline a couple years ago anyway. So, yeah. All right. With all of that out of the way, that is kind of my ideal peace treaty. Hopefully such a peace treaty would last and would not cause World War III. I've also seen, worryingly, this is a bad thing. There have been talks within the EU of allowing Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia to deploy nukes, to allow Sweden to develop their own nuclear program, to allow Germany to develop their own nuclear program. We're looking at a serious case where, because of the U.S. withdrawal from the European continent, in terms of nuclear deterrence policy, the Europeans are beginning to take matters into their own hands. And from a nuclear proliferation standpoint, that is a huge red flag and a very big concern. But theoretically, Ukraine may or may not be part of that umbrella going forward. Okay. Is there anything else I want to touch on? No, I think I hit most of my points. Hopefully you enjoyed this sort of video. Sorry if I was a bit scatterbrained all over the place. Yeah, like I said, I don't have a script. I'm just kind of riffing. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed that. Next video in the Trump series will be out hopefully in a week or two, like I said. And I guess I will catch y'all on the flip side.